From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Washington Post. Welcome to the first event of the first day of the 11th year, that's a lot of ones, of the National Book Festival. It's a wonderful event. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. It's so rewarding as somebody who has dedicated their lives to books, my life, to books, to see so many wonderful authors gathering and so many wonderful readers. You're going to find the warmest, most adoring, receptive crowd out there. And we're not going to have any rain, so. My name is Maria Rana, and I'm a writer at large for the Post and the former books editor here. Before I introduce your host this morning, I'd like to point out our guest of honor. Where is he? The wizard of the National Book Festival, Dr. James Billington. Where are you, Jim? Jim. Dr. Billington created the festival with First Lady Laura Bush, and he now co-hosts it with President and Mrs. Obama. He is the festival's leading light. For 24 years, and during an enormously vibrant period of change, he has been a marvelously productive Librarian of Congress. Did you know that there have only been 13 Librarians of Congress in 210 years? You learned it at the Washington Post. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephen Hills, the President and General Manager of the Washington Post, and our host this morning. Steve has 30 years of history in the media. He has held innumerable roles in the course of his media career, from the newsroom to the sales office to the executive floor. He was named President and General Manager of the Washington Post Media in 2008. The Washington Post Media is a multi-platform news organization that has the highest combined market penetration in print and online of any top 10 metropolitan newspapers in the country. The Washington Post Media Company has been a charter sponsor of the festival for all of its 11 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Hills.
Thanks, Marie. Well, welcome everybody. You know, at the Washington Post, we're kind of fond of the printed word, and this is sort of what we make our living doing. So it's a great honor to welcome all the kindred spirits here. You know, as Marie said, we've been a charter sponsor of this wonderful, wonderful event for 11 years. And we've been hosting this breakfast that allows you to sort of get to know each other for the last 3 years. And we're excited about this because this is what we do. We try to, at the Post, we try to still fulfill the mission of entertaining, enlightening, and informing. And sometimes informing means bringing people down, and hopefully it also means bringing people up and lifting them up and uniting the community. And that's what we try to do, and that's what we're trying to do today. And the program we're going to have today is exciting. You're going to hear from some great speakers, and I think you'll be really pleased to hear some of the people that we have lined up. But let me first just talk for say a couple things about that might give you some hope about literacy. David Rubenstein last night, I don't know if some of you may not have been here, some of you were, but he talked about some sort of scary numbers about literacy in the United States. Let me tell you something that's kind of hopeful about literacy and about in Washington and what we're trying to do with the Washington Post. So people talk about people not reading, but here's a couple stats for you that they're important. So one is that 40% of the people in Washington today read the printed Washington Post. So people are still actually reading and they're still educated. And even young people, today 30% of young people read the printed Washington Post in the last week. That's 18 to 34-year-olds. So there are actually people still reading the printed newspaper, and of course online there's people reading even more than that. So there is literacy, there are people still reading. And I'm going to tell you one thing about sort of, our attempts at storytelling. If for those of you who don't read the Post, the kind of thing we try to do, there's this great story I was thinking about because it was just the 10th year anniversary of September 11th. And for those of you who are readers of the Post, you may have already read the story, but if not, I encourage you to look at the Post. This is the kind of thing you're missing. there was an amazing story, and we're all here you're all storytellers. And it was about September 11th, and this woman who was, this kind of stuff you couldn't make up. Central casting. There's this beautiful young woman who had just become a pilot for the National Guard, and that on September 11th, she was so excited about flying. Her plane was scrambled, and her assignment was, they realized that people were taking these planes and using them as weapons. Her assignment was to take down Flight 93. And they didn't have missiles on this plane. So her assignment was to fly her plane into Flight 93. And that was the most incredible story. The follow-up story that we also reported on was that her father was a pilot for United. And in fact, there was a fairly high chance that her father would be flying that plane, and she did not know if her father was flying that plane. So this is just the kind of story, and you'll see then today, if you read the Post today, you'll see that today we have stories from the question of if particles are actually going faster than the speed of light, to the opposite extreme, Rick Perry. And Rick Perry's, an assessment by Dan Balse that's actually quite interesting. So we try every day to do what you all do every day, tell engaging, exciting stories, and uplift the community. So it's a great pleasure to be a sponsor of this program. We're so excited to have you all here. And please enjoy the program and welcome. And Marie's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Steve. I have a really easy task as your MC today because I can count every single one of the next 4 speakers as a friend. And yet, I really didn't have to twist their arms to come here and be here today. They were very, very generous people, as well as being very talented people. We're honored and privileged to have every single one of them at the top of this very busy day. Our first speaker is Joel Achenbach, a star reporter and writer for the Washington Post and the author of 7 books that cover a wide range of subjects from politics to popular science. Joel is a prodigiously gifted writer, the kind who can take a daunting subject like the space program or a complicated presidential election and make it sing. He has been doing this on the pages of the Washington Post for 20 years, and in the interim, he has graced many an issue of National Geographic, Slate, and numerous other publications. His books, A Hole at the Bottom of the Sea, The Grand Idea, Captured by Aliens, It Looks Like a President, Only Smaller, make knowledge go down like a very sleek pill. I've seen him give speeches on insects and have audiences stand up and cheer. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you Joel Achenbach. Where are you, Joel?
Very sweet. Thanks, Marie. Steve Hills, did you hear the part about star reporter? Where are you? That's going to cost you. Okay. Marie asked me to talk about the grandeur of being a writer, the glory, the groupies, all that sort of stuff. And y'all know about that. You're writers mostly here. I want to tell you about my tweets this week. I discovered Twitter, okay? I was covering the satellite story, the crashing satellite, the UR satellites coming down. Perfect story for Twitter, because in the last 3 days, I have reported that thing was going to crash in Texas, Chicago, Africa, Australia, the Western Pacific. I'm just sending out these tweets. It's coming to you, right? Last night, I reported it might land in Portland, Oregon. And as I'm sending out these tweets, I'm watching my followers build. What a great tool. It doesn't even have to be true. It could just be potential information. It might happen. Because the thing with the satellite, it goes all over the planet. And so it was plausible that it was going to hit the people in all over Eurasia and everything. And actually, the truth is that. Last night was a classic newspaper night where our job is to report where the satellite's going to crash. And unfortunately, it was coming down right on our deadline around midnight or so. And so we're every edition, I'm on the phone, we're retopping the story, trying to say where it's coming, and we're revising this thing. I'm on the phone with the desk till midnight. And the trick is you have to write something that makes sense right then, okay, about where it is, but also makes sense the next morning after it has crashed. So you're sort of experimenting with the tense, you know. It's like it is expected to have crashed, you know, and I don't even know what tense that is. Inconveniently, in case you're curious as to where did the satellite crash, NASA has said two things. One, it doesn't know. And two, the press conference scheduled for this morning has been canceled. So where'd it go? That's our follow-up story today. Where'd the satellite go? Actually, NASA said it crashed between 11:23 p.m. and 1:09 a.m., which gives the satellite enough time to go entirely around the planet. Okay, so somewhere between the Pacific, the Atlantic, Africa, North America, Australia is where it crashed. I never tweeted that it would crash in Antarctica or the Arctic Ocean because I'm not an idiot. Okay, I mean I kept it more or less truthful. But let me just say that I've been at the Post for a long time. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, delivering newspapers, delivering the Gainesville Sun, and going out there on my bike, you know, newspaper business was different back then. Somehow, I mean, I don't know if you remember this, Steve. The way it worked with the Gainesville Sun is, and I was like this little, I was like 3 feet tall, and I would deliver the papers on my bike, and then around 7:30 at night, I'd go knock on the doors of people, and I would collect. Okay, that's how the newspaper worked. I would ask people to pay me the money, then I would have to go down to the Gainesville Sun office and give them my money. You know, and what kind of a business is that anyway? But my dream when I was a teenager was to someday be a reporter for the Washington Post. And I thought being a Post reporter would be the coolest thing in the world. And so when I was 29 years old, I got a job here at the Washington Post. And I can tell you now, after all these years, that my dream today, you know, my number one aspiration in life is still to be a reporter for the Washington Post. It's a great place, so thanks.
Thanks so much, Joel. There's no one quite like Rita Dove, a poet who is a fierce and eloquent spokesperson for her art. She is a Pulitzer Prize winner, an honorary doctorate 22 times over, the Chancellor of the American Academy of Poets. She was the Poet Laureate of the United States by the time she was 40, and has served twice in that capacity, making her one of the most vibrant defendants of poetry and poets that I can think of. Most important, however, is the poetry itself. And Rita has written many, many volumes of it, lyrical, potent, filled with grace and imagery that is quite unlike anything else in our American language. Her latest book is called Sonata Mulatica, a suite of poems about George Palgren Bridgetower, a biracial violin prodigy well known to Thomas Jefferson and Beethoven, but forgotten in the fog of time. Rita Dove is the Commonwealth Professor of English at the University of Virginia. I had the great privilege of working with Rita when she was a columnist for the Washington Post. She was one of the captains and commanders of a remarkable moment in journalism called Poet's Choice, the only regular feature in a major American newspaper dedicated to poetry. It is a pleasure to be able to welcome her back to the Washington Post and send her on to her first appearance at the National Book Festival. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Rita Dove.
Good morning. I am not a morning person. I have to say that right off the bat. And I wanted to thank everyone for coming. This is really, really great. I love this festival already. I'd like to talk a little bit about that book, Sonata Mulatica, because poetry is a strange and mutable thing. And if someone had asked me when I was 5 what I wanted to be, I wouldn't have known that I wanted to be a poet, though that's what I wanted to be. All my life, I've been confronted with variations of that old line, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" And early on it was, "What are you doing in the orchestra playing cello? What are you doing studying German?" Apparently these were not Black-approved activities. And then in high school, I remember listening to my small peer group of geeks who were muttering, "What's an honor roll student doing on the majorette squad?" And then I joined academia, and the subtext for all of my colleagues' raised eyebrows at that time was sort of, "What's an intellectual doing dancing, and dancing in sequence on the ballroom floor?" And in the publishing world, I think murmurs could bubble up over poems whenever I wrote poems about people like Robert Schumann or Albrecht Dürer or Greek myths or Italian Renaissance. The implication being that an African-American poet had no business dabbling in European culture. So this latest book, Sonata Mulatica, which Marie mentioned, might provoke another variation on that theme, to wit, what's a contemporary American woman poet doing tackling a bunch of alpha males in 18th and 19th century Europe? Well, the answer has always been the same, really. It's curiosity, curiosity and an incredible zest to find out more about something, to which I would also add, you don't necessarily get to choose your loves, and you certainly don't get to choose the date of that meeting. And this book was a case in point. Years ago, seems like years ago, but it wasn't that long ago, a few years ago, one evening, my husband and I were relaxing with a rented video. I was in the middle of copy editing what was going to be my next book of poetry at that time, American Smooth. And we were relaxing with this video on Beethoven called Immortal Beloved. It's a biopic about Beethoven, and it's not bad, it's not great, it's just right for relaxing. When there came a moment in the movie, just a few seconds, where Beethoven walks across a room, and there's a group of young musicians waiting to play for him. And among all of these eager Viennese is a young Black man with a violin tucked under his arm. And I turned to my husband and I said, "What was that?" I've heard of colorblind casting, but this is stretching a little far. And then I went immediately to the computer and Googled Black violinist Beethoven. And up came, at that time, just one short entry. And it told me his name, George Augustus Polgreen Bridgetower, violin prodigy during the reign of King George IV, and he was the son of a Polish mother and a father who called himself the African Prince. That was pretty cool. But most importantly, he had inspired Beethoven to write his violin sonata in A major, opus 47, the one that we know as the Kreutzer. And he premiered it in Vienna with Beethoven at the piano in 1803. And that certainly got my interest, my curiosity, but I had copy editing to do, so it took another year before I could get back to the notes that I scribbled down and thought, what am I going to do with this? The story wouldn't let me go. It wasn't that, I set out saying I'm going to write a bunch of poems. It just wouldn't let me go. I didn't know how to do it. The question for me was, why was Bridgetower known only to a few musicologists and historians and evidently the scriptwriters of that movie that had flashed across the screen 200 years later? And why was this sonata familiar to me and others by this entirely different name, dedicated to the French violinist Kreutzer, who had never played it and actually said it was impossible to play, it was unplayable. So I began snuffling through old books. Thank you, Interlibrary Loan. And I dug up a few more tidbits, each one more puzzling and wonderful than the last, that the diary of Queen Charlotte's wardrobe keeper, She kept a diary, not only reported on prevailing fashions of the day, but also described the exploits of a flamboyant African prince and his violin-playing son. And that among Beethoven's papers was a scribbled note, which when you translate it, says, "Hey, Bridge Tower, let's go grab a beer." It's kind of cool. And that Beethoven shredded the original dedication, which read, "For the mulatto Bridge Tower, grand pal and composer." And that he did this after Bridge Tower evidently made a saucy remark over a girl. And so for all those naysayers who had quizzed me in the past, I now had an answer. This girl who was learning German and playing the cello and doing all these strange things had been only preparing for this new quest to recover George Bridgetower's life and put it in verse. Both the history with the capital H, the history of grand exploits of archives and marble busts, and the history with the small h, the individual litanies of achievements and failures, casual beers, and deplorable jokes. And still there were moments when I was working on this book when I had to ask myself, what's a poet doing studying musical scores or following Napoleon's exploits and advances on a pushpin map, plopping down a bawdy farce in the middle of this group of lyrical poems? And the only answer I can give you is that even though I've been writing for half a century, that sounds horrible, but really it's true, for half a century now, and I still can't tell you exactly what poetry is, and I can't predict the multitudes it can contain. When I was poet laureate, I got a letter from a young mother who described poetry this way. She said, "Poetry is making the language your own," which I think is pretty good. But I'll add this one sentence to it. Poetry is making the language your own so that for a moment, a stranger can find herself humming along with your words. Thank you.
Beautiful, Rita, thank you. Our next guest is Edmund Morris, one of the most distinguished presidential biographers in the United States of America. You know him, of course, from his marvelously lyrical yet muscular biography of Teddy Roosevelt, 3 volumes strong now. In the course of writing that magnum opus, he has won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. He has climbed bestseller lists and taken his place in the pantheon of American historians. What you may not know about Edmund is that he was born in Kenya, went to school in London, studied to be a concert pianist in London, and has lived sort of a double life as a musician and a writer ever since. What other historian can you think of who's performed on the piano at Carnegie Hall? Apart from Edmund's magisterial work on Teddy Roosevelt, he has written a fascinating book about Beethoven, a richly perceptive biography of Ronald Reagan called Dutch, and a legion of pithy, incisive pieces for major publications. He has one of the sharpest pens and wryest humors I know. Known for his writerly precision and bracing wit, he is by now something of a national monument. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Edmund Morris.
Thank you, Marie. I could listen to you saying things like that all day. She's quite wrong about the weather today, by the way. There will be a torrential downpour at 3:30 this afternoon, and its epicenter will be over the history and biography tent. I know this without doubt because whenever I speak, there's always a major meteorological disturbance. I remember lecturing on Beethoven once at Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana. My arrival on campus coincided with a tornado. I spoke for an hour and a quarter to a very sparse audience. noticed 3 students sitting at the back. I said to them afterwards, it's very nice of you guys to sit around and listen to him lecture on such an abstruse subject. And they said, oh, sir, we were trying to get out, but the tornado kept blowing the door shut. I must qualify what Marie said about me studying to be a concert pianist in London. The study involved constant, querulous confidences exchanged with my wife, saying, I'm not cut out to be an advertising copywriter. I want to be a professional pianist. I want to register at the Royal College of Music and study and then join Leon Fleischer on the concert tour. I was 24 years old already, which is kind of late to start a professional training for a professional career. So one day she got bored with these fantasies and said, listen, just stop talking about it already. Go to the Royal College, sign up, study there, and I will support you. She was a school teacher. I said, all right, I will. So I marched up to the Royal College of Music, saw this flight of steps leading up to the entrance door, and knew that I could not mount them. At that moment, I realized I was not a musician. I was not a pianist. I was something else. So I went back home and told her, and she said, I knew you'd come back. I said, how did you know? She said, well, I've noticed. Whenever you play the piano and people criticize your playing, it doesn't seem to bother you. But if anybody criticizes your writing, you go berserk. I think many young people grow up with double ambitions, one genuine, one false. And if they're lucky, the false one will explode or be exploded, whereupon they follow their true star and go on to what they really should be doing. It's those of us who do not have our subsidiary fantasy exploded, who go through life making pathetic speeches on the subject, I could have been a contender, I could have been a pianist, I could have been an actor, instead of what I am. So I'm grateful to happenstance for discovering what I was at the age of 24, which is not to say, the literary career being what it is, that it was easy to get going. I was a copywriter. Started out as a copywriter, in fact, in Durban, South Africa, working for a menswear store for the Zulu market. I used to compose ads, very functional ads, saying something like, suits were 34 Rand, now 25 Rand. Picture of a suit, shop at Wolfson's. So after a year or two of designing ads of this kind, I began to feel somewhat creatively frustrated. And my break came when Mr. Wolfson Sr., who started out his business in 1916, pushing a trolley of old clothes up West Street in Durban, came in and said, Mr. Morris, I want you to design a flyer for me. I said, what's a flyer? He said, you know, a flyer, you put it in an envelope and you send it out to a lot of people and they come in and they buy clothes. I said, okay, what do I have to say in the flyer? He said, oh, say what you like, you design it. So I thought, this is my creative opportunity. And I designed a flyer with a double fold, and on the cover I drew a melancholy codfish with bags under its eyes, pushing itself through the water with languid fins and trail of bubbles coming out of its mouth. And I hand-lettered over it, science informs us that the male codfish fertilizes 3,422,000 eggs in a single ejaculation and then swims off to oblivion and dies. ... And then you open the flyer, and inside I wrote, so don't let your male feel lost and forgotten. On Father's Day, shop at Wolfson's. So I presented it to Mr. Wolfson, who was about 4'9", and he looked at it for a long time, and he called his secretary and he said, "Miss Leyden, take a letter. It is with great regret that Mr. Morris leaves us of his own accord, and we wish him every success in his new life." So I went to England and tried to write different kinds of copy. Ending up in New York in 1968, arriving in New York the day Columbia University blew up, April 1968, a great time to arrive, and worked for a few years in advertising. Kept noticing that every agency I joined, my spell there culminated with the creative director calling me in and saying, "Edmund, shut the door." After I'd been fired from my fourth agency, it occurred to me that maybe I should be writing something other than advertising. And I discovered Theodore Roosevelt, a person whose face, for some mysterious reason, had enraptured me when I was a boy of 10 in a photograph in a civic history of Nairobi. And having discovered him and beginning to write about him, discovered my real calling, which is to write biography. And all these years later, 32 years later, I finished the third volume in his life. The final volume, I rejoice to say, it was very satisfying killing him off at the age of 60. And now I find myself equally enraptured by the life and character of Thomas Edison, who is my current subject. So like Marie, who has also become a biographer, I believe, and has been laboring on Simon Bolivar for these many years, my sympathies, Marie. I'm lucky to have stumbled into this literary field, which is so inexhaustibly interesting. And I hope to continue writing biographies about inexhaustibly interesting people until I snuff it. And when I do snuff it, I want my single important relationship with the Washington Post to be perpetrated in marble. When I was living here in the late 90s, the Washington Post suddenly decided to discontinue the comic strip Zippy the Pinhead by Bill Griffith. And I was so distressed by this, I got up at 4 in the morning and wrote a passionate, handwritten, tear-stained letter to Don Graham, saying, "Don, will you please resurrect Zippy in the Washington Post? It's the only corner of the paper that gives comfort to intellectuals." And he wrote me a handwritten letter back saying, "Edmund, we'll reinstate him." So when I die, I'd like to have it chiseled on my tombstone, Edmund Morris, born 1940, perpetrated Zippy for a few more years in the Washington Post. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Edmund. It was wonderful. Last on our program, we're following strict alphabetical order here, is a woman who built a different prism on America. She is Esmeralda Santiago. Born in Puerto Rico, she came to this country as a 13-year-old, the eldest in a family that would eventually include 11 children. Undaunted by life's twists and turns, she learned English, mastered it, thought she would make a career as an actress, and attended New York City's famous performing arts high school toward that end. But ultimately, it was words that won her. She started her studies at a local community college and transferred to Harvard, from which she graduated magna cum laude. She made documentary films and wrote short pieces until she produced her first book, When I Was Puerto Rican, a milestone in American memoirs. Since then, she has written 2 more, Almost a Woman and The Turkish Lover, and 2 novels, America, and most recently, Conquistadora. She is bilingual in every way, in Spanish and English, in film and books, in memoirs and novels, in her cool-headed observations, and her electric passions. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Esmeralda Santiago.
Hi, I'm a shy person, so I sit in the furthest corner of the room. Thank you so very much. Thank you, the Washington Post. I'm thrilled to be here. And I want to tell you a little story. I am the child of parents who did not go beyond third grade in education. And I am the grandchild of 4 grandparents who were illiterate, not functionally illiterate, actually illiterate. And we were landless campesinos. We really didn't have very much. But the minute that I discovered words, that I began to learn how to read, anything that appeared before me became what fed this very curious and active little girl. It was the only way that I could sit still was if I was reading something. And the only reading that came to our home was the newspapers that my dad would bring home whenever he came home, because he used to work in the city and we lived in a very rural part of Puerto Rico. So my first reading was actually newspapers, and they were tabloids. It was about all the, car crashes and murders, and it was just all really terrible, terrible news. But I remember the first big word that I learned was from one of the newspapers in Puerto Rico, and it is a word that I have never forgotten. And I taught it to my little brother, who was at the time maybe about 3 years old, and I wanted to surprise my dad with my ability to know these words and to teach my little brother, who could barely speak properly, this big word. And the word was otolaryngologia. Otolaryngologia, and that was, ear, nose, and throat doctor. So I have never forgotten that this is where my love for words came from, a word that many, many years I became a medical transcriptionist, and then I knew what it was, and I could actually spell it from my doctors. But how did I become a writer from this? I think it was this desire, this need, when I did come to the United States, and I would go through the shelves and shelves of the public libraries in the places that we lived, that I didn't see people like me on those shelves. There were no names that sounded anything like Esmeralda Santiago, Ramona Santiago, or anyone in my family. And it was this desire to read about people like me that drove me to write about people like me. But I began to write about these people for my children, because I realized that my children need to know that their mother was the grandchild of an illiterate campesino. I am not ashamed of it. I'm proud that they survived enough for me to be here and stand before you. And it was this desire to pass on that history that drove me to write, and to write when I was Puerto Rican and subsequent memoirs. In the last few years, as I get older and my children are grown and have left home, and I had begun to think about my parents in a different way. Now that they are much older and they're more idle, I'm able to sit with them and ask them questions that I couldn't ask when they were working so very hard. And one of the things that I asked was about our ancestors, about our lives, about our history. Who is my great-grandmother? Who is my great-grandfather? And my mother and father, at first, they were very reluctant to tell me any of the history of our family. And I really realized, after many, many questions, that the reason they didn't want to talk about it is that they were ashamed about how poor they had been, and they didn't want to go there, even though they're old now and it's all over and things are very different for them. So I began to read the history of people who lived in their lifetimes and began to read the history of Puerto Rico, because that's where they were born and bred. And the more I read the history of Puerto Rico, the more I wanted to read about the history of Puerto Rico. Fortunately, I can read in both languages, and I was able to thank you again, public libraries, and the wonderful possibilities for getting any book from anywhere to your local library. But the more I read, the more I realized I am never going to learn anything about my actual ancestors, because they didn't leave documents. And obviously, they're Africans in my family because of my skin color, and my father is very, very dark. And obviously, they're Europeans from someplace because my mother is very fair. And so I begin to read this information, and the more I read, the more I realize there's a novel here. Because I can't find my actual ancestors, but I can invent them. I can create them from this research. And that's what I've done. I've written a book called Conquistadora that begins in 1844 with a young woman from Spain who comes to Puerto Rico with the idea to found a sugar hacienda, and is faced with the reality that she becomes a slaveholder and has to deal with that. And so I wrote this book. It was arduous. It took me about 10 years to write it. Part of it because I had to read it in very 19th century Spanish, and then I had to kind of figure it out and translate it for myself into current Spanish, and then translate it into English because I write in English. So it was a very different process for me than it was when I write my memoirs and I just basically remember things. But the more I wrote about it, the more I realized that this is for people like us, for the descendants of the illiterate and the poor. We have to invent our history, and we invent it from the books of other historians who have actually looked at the way people lived and about the events and how things happened and so on. And that's what I did. I invented a whole family of people. After the book was delivered, I'm getting goosebumps. One of my Facebook friends wrote and said, Esmeralda, we have the last name, and I'm doing some genealogy, and I was wondering if maybe we're cousins or something. And so I sent her the information, my dad and my grandfather's name and my grandmother's name on both sides, and so sent it to her. And so she did the genealogy and found out that we were not cousins, but that there is a Juan Santiago slave, 1844, who arrived in Puerto Rico the same year that my main character. So thank you, historians, for keeping the history alive. Thank you, librarians, for making it possible for us to get anything that we need. And thank you, genealogists, for keeping track of people for us. And thank you for being readers and for being here. And thank you, the Washington Post, for sponsoring this wonderful, wonderful festival. Thank you.
Thank you to our wonderful speakers. It's really marvelous to hear all four of those very different experiences. Some of us have to dash to the fair. I think the first group is going very soon. The rest of you, please stay and have some more coffee and some more nosh. Thank you so much for coming. Pleasure to have you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.